That's the
Slavery
book.
was destroyed within the United States at staggering costs in blood and treasure. But the struggle was over within a few ghastly years of warfare. Nevertheless, the Civil War was the bloodiest war ever fought in the Western Hemisphere, and more Americans were killed in that war than in any other war in the country's history. But this was a highly atypical, indeed unique, way to end slavery. In most of the rest of the world, unremitting efforts to destroy the institution of slavery went on for more than a century, on 1,000 shifting fronts, and in the face of determined and ingenious efforts to continue the trade in human beings. Within the British Empire, the abolition of slavery was accompanied by the payment of compensation to slave owners for what was legally the confiscation of their property. This cost the British government £20 million, a huge sum in the 19th century, about 5% of the nation's annual output. A similar plan to have the federal government of the United States buy up the slaves and then set them free was proposed in Congress, but was never implemented. The costs of emancipating the millions of slaves in the United States would have been more than half the annual national output, but still less than the economic costs of the Civil War, quite aside from the cost in blood and lives, and a legacy of lasting bitterness in the South, growing out of its defeat and the widespread destruction it suffered during that conflict. While the British could simply abolish slavery in their Western Hemisphere colonies, they faced a more daunting and longer-lasting task of patrolling the Atlantic off the coast of Africa in order to prevent slave ships of various nationalities from continuing to supply slaves illegally.
Yeah.
Even during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain continued to keep some of its warships on patrol off West Africa. Moreover, such patrols likewise tried to interdict the shipments of slaves from East Africa through the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. Brazil capitulated to British demands that it end its slave trade after being publicly humiliated by British warships that seized and destroyed slave ships within Brazil's own waters. In 1873, 2 British cruisers appeared off the coast of Zanzibar and threatened to blockade the island unless the slave market there shut down. It was shut down. It would be hard to think of any other crusade pursued so relentlessly for so long by any nation at such mounting costs without any economic or other tangible benefit to itself.
Bullshit.
These costs included bribes paid to Spain and Portugal to get their cooperation with the effort to stop the international slave trade, and the costs of maintaining naval patrols and of resettling freed slaves, not to mention dangerous frictions with France and the United States, among other countries. Captains of British warships who detained vessels suspected of carrying slaves were legally liable if those vessels turned out to have no slaves on board. The human costs were also large. The heavy drain, physical and mental, in keeping squadrons on the East African coast was reflected in the loss of 282 officers and men in the 10 years 1875 to 1885. And this did not include those invalidated home. Naval personnel, racked by fever, sunstroke, and dysentery, were forced to retire prematurely and live on a small pittance. The cost of upkeep of the squadron over the 20 years prior to 1890 was estimated at 4 million sterling, and this did not take into account the large amount of work imposed on consular and judicial staff at Zanzibar in trying cases and dealing with reports, etc. Even so, the results were slow in coming. More streamlined slave ships were designed in hopes of being able to outrun the ships of the Royal Navy in the Atlantic.
True.
Nevertheless, the dogged persistence of the British eventually reduced the shipment of slaves across the Atlantic and across the waters of the Islamic world. Although the French flag was for many years widely used as protection from the boarding of ships on the high seas by the British Navy, even by slave traders who were neither French nor authorized to fly the French flag, eventually France itself turned against slavery, outlawed the institution, and sent some of its own warships to patrol the Atlantic off the coast of Africa to intercept and deter the shipment of slaves to the Western Hemisphere. The American flag was likewise so used, and the United States, like France, eventually turned against the slave trade and sent warships to join the Atlantic patrols to interdict slave shipments. Although by 1860, the Atlantic slave trade had been effectively stopped, The slave trade from East Africa across the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf took longer to be reduced significantly. Off the east coast of Africa, smaller Arab vessels called dhows hugged the coastlines in waters too shallow for the British warships to enter. One British commodore estimated that he captured one dhow for every 8 that escaped. Nevertheless, during the period from 1866 to 1869, 129 slave vessels were captured and 3,380 slaves were freed. When the threat of being boarded seemed imminent, the Arabs would throw slaves overboard to drown, rather than have them be found on board, which could lead to British seizure of the vessel and punishment of those who manned it. The worst that could befall the slaves was when the slaver was overhauled by a British cruiser, and they might then be flung overboard to dispose of all evidence. Devereux mentions a case where the Arabs, when pursued by an English cruiser, cut the throats of 24 slaves and threw them overboard. Colomb also states that Arabs would not hesitate to knock slaves on the head and throw them overboard to avoid capture. Because there were only a few naval ships available to cover a vast expanse of water in this region, British warships would often launch smaller boats to engage the Arab slave dhows. In these cases, as one study put it, the slave traffickers frequently did not hesitate to attack boat crews in defense of their profits. Battles between the Arabs' vessels and the smaller British craft were especially likely when the larger ships that launched them were too far away to reach the scene in time to join the battle. In other cases, the Arabs fled even from the smaller British vessels. An episode in 1866 was typical. On 26 April 1866, the Penguin set out after a dhow and fired several shots in an effort to make the crew come to. When the dhow failed to lower its sail, Gartorth felt certain that she was a slaver and ceased firing for the sake of the slaves on board. However, he managed to close with the dhow, which then made for the rocks through a heavy surf. By the time the ship's boats could be lowered to follow, the Arab crew had fled, but the pounding surf made any attempt by the slavers to salvage the human cargo too dangerous. To their horror, the boat crew found that they too could not reach the dhow, which was rapidly filling with water, drowning the slaves. The boat officer decided that he could not risk coming in close to the dhow, but several of the crewmen of the cutter recklessly dived in and swam through the surf to the dhow. In a remarkable display of courage, the sailors managed to bring 28 of the slaves back to the boat. But the dhow appeared to have had more than 200 slaves on board, and most died in the pounding waves. In another episode, the Arabs' ruthlessness toward the slaves was further revealed. When the Daphne's cutter captured a dhow with 156 slaves on board, many were found to be in the final stages of starvation and dysentery. One woman was brought out of the dhow with a month-old infant in her arms. The baby's forehead was crushed, and when she was asked how the injury had happened, she explained to the ship's interpreter that as the boat came alongside, the baby began to cry. One of the dhowmen, fearing that the sailors would hear the cries, picked up a stone and crushed the child's head. This was not a unique act. British missionary and explorer David Livingstone related a similar incident on land. One woman, who was unable to carry both her load and young child, had the child taken from her and saw its brains dashed out on a stone. Dr. Livingstone also reported having nightmares for weeks after encountering Arab slave traders and their victims. Not only was this Christian missionary shocked by the brutality of the Arab slave traders, so was Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, who was a battle-hardened military commander. None of this means that the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade should be ignored, downplayed, or excused, nor have they been. A vast literature has detailed the vile conditions under which slaves from Africa lived and died during their voyages to the Western Hemisphere. But the much less publicized slave trade to the Islamic countries had even higher mortality rates en route, as well as involving larger numbers of people over the centuries, even though the Atlantic slave trade had higher peaks while it lasted. By a variety of accounts, most of the slaves who were marched across the Sahara toward the Mediterranean died on the way. While these were mostly women and girls, the males faced a special danger. castration, to produce the eunuchs in demand as harem attendants in the Islamic world. Because castration was forbidden by Islamic law, the operation tended to be performed, usually crudely, in the hinterlands, before the slave caravans reached places within the effective control of the Ottoman Empire. The great majority of those operated on died as a result. But the price of eunuchs was so much higher than the price of other slaves that the practice was still profitable on net balance. The British Governor General of the Sudan,
All right, gonna have
C.G.
to pause that
Gordon,
real quick. You raising your
I have
hand.
a question. I've listened. I've heard similar narratives before. I'm familiar with the literature on the overall subject matter. Is there a culmination? Like, what is this culminating in? Where is it heading, and where is it going? Like, what is the main message here?
I think it all stems from the education system. When people look at America and they're more like liberal minded, they start to think things along the lines of police brutality, racism towards black people. It's like the white Caucasian group, specifically from America, are the ones that are like the poster child. And when it comes to this type of thing, so I
Can
think
I ask you a
his
question?
main question is:
Are you saying that Sowell is trying to break stereotypes? That that the demonization of white people because of slavery is undue and unfair, because when contrasted against slavery, the larger backdrop of slavery, there are more diverse stories to tell, such as what he included with the British. Is that what I'm to understand?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's kind of silly to put it to you like this: the Arabs did nothing different than anybody else, right? If you really want, I'm going to find one of my lectures. It's by Professor William Mackey, where he talks about the Hanseatic League and the role that they played in slavery in the Baltic regions. Why? Because when you really think about it, where does the word slave come from? Somebody tell me.
Like Slavic, I guess.
Thank you. Right? So when a word describing a certain status becomes identified with a particular people, that should really tell you who the poster children are for slavery. Right? It's not us. It's just that because ours was the most recent in history, it just so in hindsight, when you turn around and look, that which is closer appears larger, right? And that which is further away appears smaller. Mm-hmm. But then when you put it all together, it's like, oh, wait a minute, I may have kind of miscalculated here, right? But at the end of the day, Britain did what it did because its economy benefited from material resources that were brought about by the subjugation of Africans, be it slavery, colonialism, or any mode in between, because there were combinations as well, right? And one thing people often forget is that a lot of people don't understand why when you go to West Africa today, even in places like Ghana or Senegal, you will find Africans with Western last names handed down to them through the generations. People like Anderson. In fact, one of my favorite scholars, De Graaf Johnson. He was a Ghanaian with the last name Johnson, writing in the 1700s. Where do you think he got that name from? From his slave master in West Africa. Slavery was in West Africa. I'm talking about foreign enslavement. The same way, the same chattel slavery that we suffered from in the West, our African counterparts and ancestors and brothers and sisters in Africa, they were under the same system. They were under the same system. In fact, much of the subjugated world was at that time, including whites in Europe. And what you're really looking at is just okay, here's the difference, right? This might be one of the differences. If you're going to throw the white man a bone, the slavery that we experienced under white in the West, and even in Africa, was very reflective of the relationship between barren landowners and serfs in medieval Europe. Okay? When you're talking about serfdom. Mm-hmm. And when you look at all of the trappings of slavery in America, and you look at the trappings of serfdom in Britain roughly around the same time, or just prior to, right? You find the exact same system in place. First Knights, right? You know about First Knights, right?
Can you explain First Nights? I'm not familiar with that.
First Nights was if one of the people on my land in say Saxony or in the Duchy of the Angram or whatever, right? If one of my land tenants was going to get married to one of the most beautiful women on my land, as the landowner, I had the right to go have sex with her before you married her the night before you got married. Okay? How different is that from slave owners having sex with our women at will? Like, what's the difference? You got to remember, history unfolds in terms of economics. The first thing America did to Russia was to impose sanctions. That was the first bomb they dropped, economic bombs. First bomb they dropped, and it's been mostly economic, right? It doesn't, and the weapons only serve as kind of, I don't want to say a backdrop, but the weapons are just another part of the conversations in an economic discussion. So at the end of the day, it's an economic discussion. One of the fallacies, unfortunately, that a lot of people like to push, and there might be some truth to it, but in overall, it's a general fallacy, is that, well, slavery in Africa was more benign. It was more like, and in some cases it was. In some cases, it was an umbrage under which you could absorb an unfortunate you could absorb a disenfranchised family and make them a part of your household, and the slavery relationship detailed the obligations due from one party to the other. When you want to talk about slavery, start with Egypt. Start with Egypt. I love Egypt. I subscribe to their worldview, to their aesthetics. I've always sought most of my adult life to understand it through academia. And like I told people in my last presentation, I don't have the last word. You don't have the last word. The historical record, the evidence has the last word. The documentation and the evidence. So if you look at the documentation and evidence in Egypt, ancient Egypt, I teach a whole course on black masters, white slaves. And it's just chock full of documentation, right? It's just really, really it's chock full of documentation. The premise is that, number one, black people enslaved white people first. That's number one. We never had that discussion before. I've never mentioned that to you before.
You did. I'm pretty sure you have.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I'm pretty sure I have.
That's one of the reasons why I brought you on here, because I wanted to hear your viewpoints.
Right. Black people enslaved white people first. The real early record of slavery in Africa, and particularly as it relates to black people enslaving white people, and Africans enslaving themselves, enslaving one another in Africa on African soil in the 3rd, 4th millennium BCE. Like, that's where you really want to look at it, because you can't blame anybody else. You can't point your finger and be like, oh, white people did this, white people did that. No, it's us. We did it. Right? We are the ones that introduced slavery as an institution to planet Earth. You better wrap your mind around that, Jack. I don't need to read Sowell to know that. I've read Herodotus. Okay? I've read Martin Bernal out of Cambridge University by way of Cornell University. Like, I've read the work, and then I went and did the research myself, and I read the stuff out of UCLA. So I know for a fact we introduced it to planet Earth.
And you know how politics be, man. So you can't have a nice, reasonable debate. It's always got to be like one side or the other. You know what I'm
saying? I think that's stupid, because I think that's silly, because it's like saying, I need history to be black and white. You know what I'm saying? It's like when people argue about race and they pretend only black people and white people exist on the planet. Like, there are a whole lot of other people that are not black or white that are part of that story. So if real life is not black or white, then why should we have to render things in such stark terms? Like, you have to leave area for nuances. You have to leave room for things that act as catalyst for other things, because then you can have a much better understanding of the common threads that runs through it all, which I think will really give you a big picture perspective, which is what I always want. Like, what's the big picture perspective?